Well, from your breath to your face to your heartbeat, Rafael Lozano-Hemmer turns the most intimate identifiers into art. We're joined now by the artist here to tell us about his work, including his new exhibit at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Jacksonville. Rafael, thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure to be here.
So, this is part of the museum's Project Atrium series, which is staged in sort of a large vertical space right at the entrance to the museum. Talk about how you created something specific for that space.
Well, first of all, I came, I visited, I talked to the curators and understood what had happened there before. When I came, I saw a massive sculpture by one of my heroes, Frank Stella. And I thought, okay, this is very intimidating to come right after Frank Stella, especially in an artwork which was probably the last one he ever made while he was still alive. And it was a beautiful, glorious sculpture. But what I decided to do is go the other way, is instead of creating a big object, I created more, let's call it an interactive installation, something that's immersive, something that invites the public to be in the space and be surrounded by light, surrounded by graphics and sound.
And so your piece actually incorporates body heat, ambient temperature. Talk about just the technology and how it's translated into a visual.
For sure. The experience is called spectral subjects, and it's basically these thermographic cameras. They're basically cameras that don't look at light, they look at heat. And so they're actually painting a picture with the turbulence of air coming from AC, from our human bodies, or from objects in the room. And what you see is an alternative view of the dynamics of the space. And it's kind of interesting because this kind of art that I make is art that is participatory. It depends on people to exist. So you're an integral part of the experience. As you traverse the atrium, excuse me, as you traverse the atrium, these cameras capture your presence and then show you as some kind of signature or as a trace on a never repeating animation that takes place on three walls. So projected colossally around you is images of yourself, images of those people who have been there before you, and also how the heat that is generated by all of these bodies accumulates and dissipates.
And so much of your artwork depends on gathering something from the viewer and repurposing it as art. And I want to talk about some of the specific things that you've done, which are so interesting. But how do you know as an artist that you can kind of depend on your audience to produce something that is satisfying to you?
To an extent, that's part of the humbling part of being an artist that allows for interactivity, right? Because it depends on what people give. That's what you're going to get. The artwork feels you. The artwork remembers you. I'll give you an example. I had made one of the projects that I've been making for the past 20 years is a sensor that measures your heartbeat and then represents this heartbeat in a little flickering light bulb. Only we have 3,000 of these light bulbs. And so as you traverse this exhibition space, you're surrounded by the 3,000 heartbeats that are beaming the vital signs of the past 3,000 participants. The reason I am sure people will participate is because of that responsibility that if they don't, those light bulbs are off, that
Mm.
there is nothing to see. So there is a relationship of authorship that gets shared with the public, and I think that people love that responsibility actually. And we live in a society of spectacle and selfies and reality TV. People are very comfortable sort of playing a part in one of these pieces because they see themselves, they're creating something with their participation, and I think that more and more we need those experiences where the public feels like they are the key to the artwork.
One of the projects that you did involved this array of microphones where you were recording voices and that speaking into these microphones, which could capture hundreds of thousands of recordings each. Then they're also playing back voices from the past. Explain how that worked and kind of what you got out of that.
Yeah, so imagine you walk into a room, there's whatever, 10 microphones at different heights. They're big, Shure microphones, the vintage ones. You speak into them. And what we did is we took away the microphone from the inside and we replaced it with a tiny microphone, a loudspeaker, and a computer. So the microphone listens to you, but it also records you and then plays back a recording from any of 600,000 recordings from the past. So as you speak, it speaks back to you. And we're not used to putting our ear to a microphone to hear a voice, an echo from the past. But it's quite fun because, for example, I have one of these microphones at my house. When we first did it, my mom was still alive and she said a bunch of stuff. And then sometimes I speak into the microphone, she answers back. It sends me straight to psychotherapy. But the spirit is that the artwork keeps growing because my kids speak into it or different visitors speak into it. And then the content of the work, what is the echo of it, is whatever was put inside.
And so, very often your artwork creates a community of the people who are viewing it
That's right.
together. It requires their participation, but then it also turns them universally into this piece of art. Why is it important to you to create those kind of connections among people who are just in a gallery
Yeah.
randomly?
I think that the highest calling of art is to create experiences to be shared, to have people come together. We live in extremely solitary times, and especially after COVID, we had this sense of social distance and of disconnection. Politically, I think that there's a lot of division going around, and the art's job is to create a platform for people to feel comfortable and to create community. So, how can we use these technologies that oftentimes are there to either track us or survey us, to create experiences that are connective, to create a shared experience that we all can enjoy.
And I'm not sure if the exhibit was called Trackers that you did, but it was very surveillance dependent.
Yeah.
And it often, like, we would measure the distance between people. It would let them know relationally how long they were next to each other. And it's fascinating to watch a group of people in the room looking around at all of these surveillance images of themselves and the data that is derived from those images. But it also calls to mind, obviously, the ways that surveillance can be used and even is used in some authoritarian countries right now. I think of China, where there's just an enormous amount of facial recognition technology and tracking that's of everyday citizens.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my work is always straddling that border between the seduction of participation and inclusion, and you're the artwork, but also the sinister, almost Orwellian, predatory technologies that are quite quotidian, and that in a way, these artworks allow you to make them evident, to sort of help you have that debate, to talk about the state in which machines can track us. And of course, you mentioned China, which is fair, but it happens to all of us, right? Our phones are tracking us. We have an Amazon Alexa in our home, and it has 7 microphones that are listening to everything we're saying. So this is very commonplace now. And I do this not as a moralist statement saying, well, surveillance is wrong. I mean, surveillance is inevitable, but I do think that there are ways in which we can pervert the ways these technologies were originally designed, which is to count us, to have this metrics, to make us be part of society that is really determined by these statistics, and instead create something that is poetic or absurd or critical. I think that that's the job of the artist, is to take those technologies and don't make them about those sinister or more sinister uses. At the same time, I have a feeling that there is a way to understand an artwork, which is this. We used to think that you'd go to a museum to see a sculpture and be inspired by it, or a painting, right? Now it is the artwork that senses you. It is the artwork that listens and sees you. And it is the artwork that is expecting for you to do something interesting with it. So it's very theatrical. When people come to MOCA, what they'll see is a colossal projection. They'll see that it never repeats itself. They'll see that there's a dramaturgy. In other words, it takes over time, it changes. And so the artwork is an invitation to be there with others and to discuss, well, what is the role of these technologies, but also how can we form a community.
You are a Mexican Canadian artist, and you have done some work recently that was profiled in a PBS series called Borderlands.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about the project that is down in kind of the border towns of El Paso and
Juarez.
Juarez.
Yeah, so in 2019, over the course of about 3 weeks, we put 3 interactive stations in El Paso and 3 interactive stations in Mexico. They were all identical. They're basically a microphone, a loudspeaker, and a little dial or tuning wheel that you could turn. And as you did, very, very powerful robotic searchlights would penetrate the airspace of the other country like a massive bridge of light over the border. And as my lights and your lights intersected in midair, we would open a bidirectional channel of communication so that you could hear me and I could hear you. And if I didn't like what you were saying, I would just tune you out and look for somebody else because there were six stations in total. Over the course of these 3 weeks, every night, tens of thousands of people from El Paso and Juarez would come together at the border to speak to each other through these bridges of light. It was very emotional because there's a lot of family members on the other side who had not seen each other for a while. But there was also everything from serenades to a lot of flirting to
Mm.
manifestos. And it was lovely to see how people in the area were using this artwork to represent a voice that is normally not heard. When we hear about the border, we always hear about different types of violence or problems. And yet, in this particular thing, the citizens came out to take over the border as a place to be united. So it was one of the best projects I've done, not because of what I did, but the way in which people used the technology and used the artwork to communicate to each other.
I thought it was interesting too that you said, the wall, kind of the border is this dominant narrative that we always hear, but when you're down there in those communities, that they're sick of focusing on the division. They're sick of focusing on the wall or the border, that they really are much more focused on the fact that these are really sister communities with enormous interaction between the families on each side. The populations have a lot of connections that cross that border.
That's exactly right. And so my job wasn't so much to make new bridges between the two sister cities, but to highlight the fact that those bridges already exist. They should have a shared history. There are fraternal connections, environmental, definitely economic relationships. So there is a disconnect between this idea of division and separation, and then the reality of El Paso and Juarez, which was a city actually 100 years before the U.S. actually existed. There was already the city there. So I have a feeling that one of the reasons why this project was successful is because the people see it as natural to have that connection, and they wanted to, at least for a while, forget about the border and be able to talk about what is shared, what is that humane sort of connection that we all
It
have.
is surprising too. I mean, in the documentary, they showed this. You kind of visit this aerial lookout point where you can see the vast expanse of these two adjacent cities. And were you surprised at just how much cross connection, how much they look like a single city divided by a highway?
Yeah, I mean, to the degree that the people that took me around, I took the opportunity to meet hundreds of artists who participated in the project. And one of the things that they were saying to me the most is, we don't really need artists such as yourself, with privileges coming here to tell us like a land a UFO, about this work. What we really want is to be listened to. And so Border Tuner is about listening. It's like, how can we create this tuning devices where we can make these two realities, listen to each other? And that's, I think, the strength of art.
Your creative process is really different. I mean, I've seen you say you don't stand at a canvas waiting for inspiration, that you like to describe the workspace, your studio, is more of a factory
Mm.
or a laboratory. Explain kind of how you come up with these projects.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I am actually a scientist. I originally studied chemistry in university. My parents were nightclub owners in Mexico, so I had to rebel some way. That's my way. I became a scientist. But then after a while, I decided to be an artist. I was a programmer and I started working with other people. So always in collaboration and always with an experimental desire, right? Like there's this sense of the unknown, which I think is something that both science and art have, right? We all throw ourselves into, trying something new. We don't know if it's going to work or not, but that's part of the joy of investigating and doing research. So the artworks are usually big collaborations. For example, the one we have here at MOCA is done by at least 12, 15 people, between programmers and producers and curators who have put together all of this work. So this idea of the artist as a solitary genius who is in front of their canvas, I know that there are some out there, but I'm certainly not one of them. I'm more like a theater director where I get to conduct really talented people to come through in a project like Spectral Subjects.
You've described it as somewhere more of a relationship as like an architect.
Or more performing arts. I think it's more like theater because if you think about it, these artworks are alive. They are always changing. They're irrepeatable. When you walk into the atrium, you're seeing something that will never be seen again. It's almost like a mirror or something that captures the ephemeral nature of existence because the the normal thing that we think about museums is that they give us unchanging references throughout history, right? Like you will all go see the same painting and then have this shared point. But what if the artwork itself is the one that is evolving and changing over time? I think that that invites us to share that more theatrical moment of, oh, this is just happening right now. It's live and it'll disappear. And that's both joyful and mournful because at the end, when these artworks record you, you will also be erased from the content. And that erasure, it's also a memento mori. It's this moment of reflection on the fact that we're only here on Earth for a little time and we have to make the best use of it.
One of the exhibits that I thought was very interesting that you have called 33 questions per minute. Explain for people who don't know it,
Okay.
what it entails.
So that piece was is now 25 years old. It was originally for the Havana Biennial, and it was AI. It was a very early version of artificial intelligence. It's basically a piece of software that takes all the words from the dictionary, and it knows how to conjugate verbs, and has grammatical rules. But it has the following rules. There's an algorithm that says pick words at random from the dictionary. Number two, form a grammatically correct question. And usually they're silly. There's things like, will you bleed in an orderly fashion? Like a very strange combination, but grammatically correct. And then third, don't ever repeat the same question. So it'll take 55 billion years for the artwork to actually go through all of the combinations of questions. And it presents them in this little detonator style screens that make a little beep and they're presented 33 times per second. So it's kind of frustrating to try and read it.
What's the significance of the 33 per second?
It's the threshold of human legibility. So it's enough time to read the question, but by the time that you're actually trying to answer it, already the next question is there. So it's right, it's a little bit of a piece about that kind of data density. We're all just, bombed with information from all sides. So that piece does that. I should mention that that's the very, very, very first piece that was acquired by a big museum. It was acquired by MoMA in New York City. And that really helped because all of a sudden other museums felt like this kind of material, this kind of electronic art or media art could be collected. So 33 questions per minute was a very early exploration into AI. It's kind of like a linguistic poem. It's never ending. I think of it almost like a fountain. It's just constantly coming up with like really strange combinations of words.
But some are very profound too.
Some are very profound. And I mean, politically, I should mention this project was done at a time when Cubans could not have access to the internet. But myself, as a Mexican Canadian, I could actually have access to the internet. So I connected the artwork to the internet and invited Cubans to enter any question that they wanted. And the question was presented in the flow of automated questions in such a way that the authorities could not determine if this question was asked by a person or by a computer. So, like a reverse Turing test. And I love that because I think that Cubans, really wanted to have access to the internet. They wanted to speak their mind, but the government censorship and all sorts of different political reasons, they could not do it. So through this work, they could send messages out into the internet, and the authorities could not censor them.
That's fascinating. So this upcoming exhibit, it is at, we said, MOCA Jacksonville. It runs from December 13th to June 1st, but the celebration for the opening is the 12th, which is tomorrow. Um, More information is available at mocajacksonville.unf.edu. But you're also doing an event just personally at the museum on the following Saturday.
I think that there's a whole bunch of different events. I am going to come back more in the spring to do an event myself. I do know that MoCA and in general the University of North Florida is paying close attention to the programming around the show. To be honest, I've been so submerged in programming these days that I haven't kept up with what's happening. After for me, it's all the openings tomorrow. You gotta deliver.
Well, it's a great opportunity to meet a really extraordinary artist, and we're so happy to have you here. Rafael Lozano-Hemmer, thanks so much for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.